A few days ago, on a quiet Tuesday evening, I found myself finally relaxing on the couch after a long day. It was around 8 p.m., and the kids were already tucked into bed. The house was peaceful, and I was enjoying the calm after the chaos of the day. I had just finished dinner, and everything seemed to be in its place. But then out of nowhere, the phone rang, piercing the silence. I paused for a moment, wondering who could be calling at this hour. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, which instantly caught my attention. In the past, these types of calls were often just telemarketers or wrong numbers. But this felt different. "Hello?" I answered, holding the phone to my ear, speaking quietly so I didn't wake the kids. To my surprise, it was Emma, my wife, calling. I was a bit confused. Why was she calling me now? We had just spoken a few hours ago when she left her office. We usually touch base in the evening after work, but this felt different. Emma works as a project manager at a growing tech company. She's always on the move, attending meetings, and managing teams. I stay home with the kids and handle the household responsibilities, which works well for us. Despite our busy lives, we found a balance that keeps everything running smoothly. We live in a comfortable home in the suburbs, with a small garden and a cozy living room where we often spend time together when things quiet down. But this call, it was unexpected. Emma's voice was more serious than usual, and I could tell something was on her mind. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, sensing the change in her tone. "I'm fine," she replied, but there was a pause. "I just wanted to tell you about something strange that happened today at work." Her voice trailed off, as if she was deciding how much to share. I leaned back on the couch, the peaceful atmosphere from moments earlier now replaced by a growing curiosity. Emma doesn't usually call me with this kind of urgency. I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing, so I listened closely. She started to explain how she'd received an odd message from a colleague earlier in the day, one that didn't make much sense. The message was cryptic and seemed out of place, and she was unsure how to handle it. Emma was often the one who had all the answers, the level-headed one, but I could tell this had caught her off guard. As she continued talking, I realized the night wasn't going to be as quiet as I had hoped. So I brushed that concern aside, and life went on as usual. But today, something unusual happened. While I was going through some old documents looking for our car insurance policy, I came across a folder that didn't seem to belong. Inside, I found monthly statements from a separate account that my wife, Emma, manages on her own. This account holds funds from an inheritance she received after her parents' tragic passing 2 years ago. I've always respected Emma's privacy when it comes to this account. It's her inheritance, and I've never wanted to overstep. She's always been careful with money, and I trusted her to manage it in her own way. But as I flipped through the pages, I couldn't help but wonder just how much the money had grown. I remembered when Emma first received the inheritance. It was around $280,000 at the time. That amount had come from the estate of her parents after a terrible accident. As I looked through the statements, I saw that the balance had grown to over $320,000. I felt a sense of surprise mixed with admiration. Emma's been doing well with her investments, and the numbers didn't lie. But there was something else that caught my eye. About a month ago, there had been a withdrawal of $2,500 from the account. It seemed small compared to the overall amount, but it was enough to spark my curiosity. Naturally, I started to wonder what that money was used for. The withdrawal came just a few weeks after Emma had mentioned losing her wallet while out shopping. I couldn't shake the feeling that the two might be related, so I decided to dig deeper. After reviewing the records further, I was stunned to find that a check for $2,000 had been issued to a local designer boutique, the same place Emma had mentioned she'd been when she lost her wallet. The realization hit me. Emma had used some of her inheritance to replace items lost in her purse, including a few expensive pieces of jewelry. While I didn't mind that she'd used the money for something important to her, I couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't mentioned it. Emma and I usually share everything, but this time she'd kept it to herself. I wasn't upset, but I was definitely curious. Why had she kept this from me? It made me question how much I really knew about Emma's financial decisions. She had mentioned replacing the wedding and engagement rings before, but never said anything about losing them, just that her purse had been stolen. It took me a while to process the new information that had come to light. I had just been on the phone with someone, And after hearing what they said, I felt an uneasy pit in my stomach. Listen, I told the woman on the other end of the line, I need to talk about this with my wife first before making any decisions. I'll get back to you later. I could tell she was confused by my response, but my own confusion was much stronger. It was becoming more and more clear that the rings should have been in her purse when it was stolen. But why on earth would Emma carry her wedding rings around in her purse if she had no intention of hiding her marital status from others? As far as I knew, there was no professional reason for Emma to hide her rings. She's always been upfront about her life, and her job didn't require her to conceal anything like that. The thought didn't sit well with me. Why would she keep something so personal in her purse, especially after telling me she had lost it to theft? It didn't add up, and I started to feel a growing sense of unease. I tried to push away the doubt, but every time I thought about it, more questions surfaced. Why hadn't she mentioned the rings were gone in the first place? Why was this the first time I was hearing about it? It wasn't like Emma to be secretive. But if she had indeed lost the rings in the theft, why hadn't she told me about it sooner? I wasn't upset. I was just confused. I knew that I needed to have a conversation with her to understand what had happened. When I finally hung up, my mind was racing. I walked around the house for a few minutes, trying to gather my thoughts. What should I say to Emma? How could I bring this up without sounding accusatory? But then, a bigger question loomed. If the rings had been in her purse when it was stolen, why had she never told me about their loss until now? I knew I had to confront Emma, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I needed answers. As I processed this new information, my thoughts raced, overwhelmed by the gravity of what I had just uncovered. It was becoming painfully clear that Emma had deceived me, not only by hiding the truth about her missing rings, but also by spinning a false story about losing them during a trip. While I tried to come up with other explanations, I couldn't stop the disturbing thoughts from flooding my mind. It became evident that I needed to figure out what really happened to those rings, or they would continue to haunt me, slowly driving me mad. One thing was now glaringly obvious. Those rings had been in her purse when she was seen with another man at that party a few weeks ago. It had taken me some time to process it, but the more I thought about it, the more it all started to make sense in a way that terrified me. Why else would she have been carrying them around in her purse, if not to hide them? Emma had always worn her wedding rings with pride, and the thought of her keeping them in her purse felt so out of character. As I pieced the events together, I recalled how she had acted that night, distant, almost as though she was trying to avoid any conversations about our relationship. When I asked her about the purse being stolen, she seemed unusually calm, almost too calm. Why hadn't she mentioned the rings? Surely, if she had cared about them, she would have spoken up. Several weeks had passed since that night, and Emma was about to leave for another business trip. I knew I needed to get more information about her schedule for the upcoming days. What would she be doing after work hours when she was far away from home? What exactly was she involved in when I wasn't around? It didn't sit right with me that I had so many questions and so few answers. The thought crossed my mind. What if losing the rings had been a wake-up call for Emma? A way for her to take a step back and reconsider her actions? Could she have been trying to hide something more than just the rings? If I discovered her infidelity, it would shatter everything we had built over the years. But I couldn't ignore the feeling deep down that there was more to this than met the eye. She didn't seem to notice anything unusual in my behavior at that moment. After the chaos had settled and the house was tidied up, I greeted her with a quick kiss on the cheek. We sat down at the table, just like any other evening, to enjoy dinner and have our usual conversation. As always, we talked about our day, our work, the kids, and the small details that filled our lives. But despite everything seeming normal, my mind couldn't help but race, filled with questions and suspicions I hadn't voiced yet. Given our usual routine, I didn't expect Emma to pick up on anything strange in my behavior. But something felt off. I had to know more, especially with her trip approaching. "So, you're heading out on another trip in a couple of days?" I asked casually, trying to sound interested. "Yeah," she replied, her tone flat. "It's the same old routine. I'm not really looking forward to it." There was no excitement in her voice, no sense of eagerness or anticipation. I knew that travel had become a part of her job, but this lack of enthusiasm was new. It made me want to dig deeper. If you don't enjoy it, have you thought about applying for a different position? I asked, keeping my tone light but probing. You've been with the company for a while now and know it inside and out. I think you could adapt to almost any role. She seemed to consider the idea for a moment, then shrugged. I've thought about it, but I want more experience before I transition to something more permanent, like a desk job. I don't want to rush it. I nodded, but the words didn't sit right with me. Emma had always been good at what she did, but it wasn't like her to express dissatisfaction so casually. It wasn't just about her work anymore. Something was going on and I couldn't ignore it. Trying to appeal to her sense of guilt, I said, I just think about the kids and how much we miss you when you're gone. It's hard sometimes, you know? I added, hoping it would spark some emotional response. We really miss having you around more. For a moment, Emma paused, and I could see her eyes flicker with a hint of guilt. But instead of the deep conversation I was hoping for, she just sighed and smiled softly. I know, she said. I'll make it up when I get back, okay? I wanted to believe her, but everything inside me was screaming that there was more to the story, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might find. As Emma entered the house, she didn't have her briefcase with her. I assumed she had left it in the car, but as I busied myself preparing dinner, I didn't give it much thought. We sat down at the table, and after a few minutes, she casually asked if I could fetch her suitcase from the garage once we were done eating. Certainly, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral, not wanting to give away the suspicions growing in my mind. Are you all set for your trip? I asked, doing my best to sound casual. Oh yes, she said, her voice steady. It's just a routine trip. My briefcase is in the car, ready for the journey. I'll pack an overnight bag with the essentials once we're done here. She didn't seem to sense the hesitation in my voice or the questions forming in my mind. I had to push the thought away, trying to act as though everything was completely normal. To maintain the appearance of normalcy, I decided to ask, do you have any plans while you're away? No, I'm just going to stick to the usual routine while I'm away, she replied casually. The kids and I will keep everything going as usual. Maybe we can plan something family-friendly for the weekend once I get back. She sounded genuinely enthusiastic about the idea, as if everything were exactly as it had always been. Sounds like a plan, I responded, trying my best to sound genuinely supportive. But inside, I felt like I was playing a role, pretending not to notice the undercurrent of tension between us. After dinner, Emma helped me clear the table, stacking dishes and loading the dishwasher without any sign of hurry. She always took care of these little tasks, and I appreciated it. Once we were finished, she headed to the bedroom to begin packing, while I took my time finishing up in the kitchen. As I cleaned, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her routine was so well practiced, so predictable. Yet there was an air of avoidance around her, something I couldn't quite place. When I entered the bedroom, she was already packing her things, moving efficiently through the motions. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, wondering if I should confront her or let it go for now. I could feel the weight of the questions pressing on me. What was she hiding? Why was she so distant tonight? The more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the growing sense of doubt. If there was something I needed to know, now was the time to figure it out, before she left again. I went out to the garage to retrieve Emma's suitcase as she had asked. After carefully placing it on a nearby workbench, I unlocked it. Just as I was about to continue, Jerry walked in, noticing I was busy. Well, I've got a customer waiting, so take your time, he said with a nod before heading back into the small shop connected to his station. I took a deep breath and began to sift through the contents of the suitcase. I was careful not to disturb anything too much, trying to be as discreet as possible. My hands moved along the lid, brushing the edges of the pockets when something caught my eye. A small package, partially hidden, stood out among the papers and folders. My curiosity got the best of me, and I pulled it out. To my shock, the package was open. It was a box of contraceptives. Only a few pieces were left inside. My heart sank. Every bit of doubt that had been growing in my mind now felt like a heavy weight. The worst possible thoughts flooded me all at once. My fears were confirmed. I knew Emma hadn't mentioned anything about needing those, and this wasn't something I could ignore. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. I carefully placed the package back in the suitcase, making sure it was exactly where I found it. My hands were trembling slightly, but I managed to close the case without making a sound. I quickly moved it to the trunk of the car, locking it securely, just as Jerry came back from dealing with the customer. "Did you find what you needed?" Jerry asked, looking at me with a mix of curiosity and politeness. I forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil I was feeling inside. "Yeah, just needed to grab a few things," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. With everything locked away, I closed the trunk and tried to push the moment out of my mind, but the weight of what I'd discovered lingered, leaving me restless and unsettled. What had I just uncovered? And more importantly, what was Emma hiding? She sat beside me on the couch, her presence oddly comforting yet distant, as though we were both suspended in the same moment of quiet chaos. My emotions had started to settle, but a deep, gnawing sadness lingered, heavy in my chest. It dawned on me that the life we'd shared, our once happy family, was already slipping away. By morning, I knew things would be different. I had been so focused on keeping things normal for the kids, on maintaining the illusion of stability, that I hadn't truly faced what was happening between Claire and me. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was gone, replaced by something unspoken, a cold distance that neither of us was ready to address directly. To my surprise, Claire shifted closer, curling up against me as though nothing had changed. Her warmth was familiar, almost comforting, but the weight of the evening pressed on me. She whispered softly in my ear, "Are you ready for tonight?" I forced myself to take a sip of my beer, the cool liquid doing little to calm the storm brewing inside me. "I think so," I muttered, my voice tight. "But I've got this stomach ache." Claire's hand moved gently over my arm as she snuggled closer, her touch tender in a way that felt almost out of place. "Oh, that's too bad, honey," she said sympathetically, her voice laced with something that almost sounded like concern. "You should rest. I'll take care of everything." For a moment, I allowed myself to close my eyes and pretend that everything was okay, that we were the same couple we had been before all this uncertainty began. But it was impossible to ignore the nagging thought at the back of my mind, the one that questioned why she was still here, why she still pretended to be affectionate. The betrayal that lingered between us seemed to echo in the silence of the room. Despite the hurt, a part of me couldn't let go of her. I instinctively put my arm around her shoulders, but the gesture felt hollow, like a reflex rather than a true expression of affection. Her warmth was there, but it didn't reach me the way it once did. I couldn't stop wondering why she had done this, why she had sought something beyond what we had built together. Was it excitement, a desire for something new? Or was it something I had failed to give her, something I couldn't provide despite all my efforts? Claire softly said, "I love you," her voice tender, but it didn't erase the damage. I didn't answer right away. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and yet deep down, there was still a flicker of affection for her. Despite everything, I wasn't sure how to feel, but the betrayal had clearly done its work. I didn't know what came next for us, but I knew we could never go back to how we were before. We put the kids to bed together, as we always did, and as Claire kissed our little ones good night, I couldn't help but look at her. The kids had long since grown accustomed to her frequent travels, her absences, but tonight I saw it. By morning, she would be gone, and something inside me knew that our family wouldn't be the same again. She inquired softly, her voice laced with concern. "Still not feeling well, honey?" I simply nodded, unable to find the words to express the turmoil swirling inside me. The familiar hum of the garage door closing downstairs signaled that she was preparing for the day ahead. Yet I felt trapped in a silence I couldn't escape. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. The weight of the discovery about her, the lies, the hidden secrets, felt like a leaden cloud over me. It was hard to breathe, let alone speak. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew that doing so without solid proof would only make things worse. With a deep sigh, I finally forced myself out of bed. The sounds of the kids, getting ready for school, echoed up the stairs, breaking the oppressive silence. I went through the motions of the morning, sending them off to school with a quick hug and kiss, before sitting down for a quiet breakfast alone. My thoughts kept returning to the same point. I had to find out the truth. I couldn't keep living in this state of confusion. I turned to the phone book, scanning the yellow pages for private detective services. My main priority was to find an agency with nationwide coverage, ideally in the city where Claire was heading for her business trip. I reached out to several agencies, explaining my situation, and eventually I found one with a branch near her destination. I arranged for a meeting the same morning, hoping they could help me uncover the truth I so desperately needed. As I prepared to leave, I realized that I needed more than just answers about her infidelity. The thought of divorce loomed, and the uncertainty of how to proceed weighed heavily on me. A friend had recommended a divorce lawyer, someone with a solid reputation for handling complicated cases. I called his office explaining my situation and set up an appointment for the afternoon. By the time I arrived at the private investigator's office, I felt as though I were living in a fog. I sat across from the investigator, trying to explain everything that had been happening, but the words didn't seem to capture the depth of what I was feeling. I arranged for Claire to be surveilled during her trip. I didn't know what the investigator would uncover, but I had to know. Leaving the office, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I was taking action, finally doing something, but what would I learn? And more importantly, would the truth break everything I had worked so hard to build? I hadn't immediately addressed the financial or legal matters surrounding our situation. In the back of my mind, I kept telling myself there would be enough time to take action after serving Emma the divorce papers. Given the inheritance she'd received from her parents a few years ago, I didn't believe she'd be too concerned about her share of our joint savings when the time came. Emma had always been financially independent and careful with her money, a trait that I had admired in her. But now as I began to process everything that had unfolded, I knew that those assumptions were too naive. Time was no longer on my side, and there was no more room for uncertainty. The day dragged on, each hour stretching endlessly as I tried to focus on work and the kids. The constant hum of the everyday routine did little to distract me from the gnawing feeling in my gut. The phone rang a few times, but I ignored it, not wanting to deal with anything or anyone. My mind kept circling back to that moment in the garage, the discovery that had started it all, the sense that something was horribly wrong. After school, I headed home early to catch the bus. I was trying to keep my emotions in check, trying to act normal. When Emma returned later that afternoon, I offered to help with her laundry as I always did. She politely declined, her tone casual, but I knew her refusal wasn't about the laundry. It was about control. Emma liked to manage everything herself, especially when it came to the things that mattered most. I couldn't help but grin at the irony of it. Deep down, I understood why she preferred to handle it herself. It was her way of keeping her secrets hidden. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I truly knew about her life. We had built a family together, yet so much had been kept from me. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Emma expressed concern about my ongoing stomach issues. I could tell she was genuinely worried, but it felt distant, almost detached, as if she was playing a role to keep up appearances. "You really should see a doctor," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "I'll be fine," I replied quietly, my mind still reeling. I wasn't sure if it was the stress or something more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was spiraling into a situation I wasn't prepared for. When I first looked at the photo, it became glaringly obvious. She was still wearing the rings. The image had clearly been taken discreetly with a mobile phone. The report detailed the agent's movements, explaining that they had rented a room just across from Emma's, a tactic designed for unobtrusive surveillance. At precisely 6:31 p.m., the report indicated that the agents received a signal that Emma had left her room and was heading for the elevator. A minute later, at 6:32 p.m., she exited the elevator and entered the hotel lobby. The report continued with a meticulous description of her appearance, matching the earlier provided example. The agents had noted that Emma was wearing a striking red cocktail dress paired with sleek black heels, far more formal than I expected for a typical evening. Around her neck, the pendant I had given her for our 10th anniversary gleamed in the soft hotel lighting. My chest tightened at the sight of it. It was a reminder of better times. But what stood out most wasn't the necklace. It was the conspicuous absence of the wedding rings on her left hand. The photo clearly showed her without them, a fact that seemed too obvious to ignore. The report had been precise in its details, capturing every aspect of her movements, and yet this glaring omission felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't warned them. Did she not want to be associated with her marriage? Or had something happened that made her choose to leave them behind? Perhaps it was a conscious decision, made with care. The thought that she might have intentionally removed her rings before going out sent a cold shiver through me. The agents had observed the situation carefully, recording every detail. They mentioned that Emma had spent some time in the lobby, waiting for someone, though no one else was noted as entering the lobby with her. A few minutes later, she had disappeared out of view, but the uncertainty of the situation left my mind spinning. As I sat there processing the report and the photo, it was becoming harder to ignore the uncomfortable truth. Something was off. Emma's actions were no longer adding up to the life we had built together. The trust I had once taken for granted had eroded, and now I was left to piece together the fragments of a marriage that no longer felt real. Would I ever truly understand what was going on? Or had I already waited too long to confront the truth? While Emma was away, I struggled to make sense of everything that had come to light. Her betrayal was far worse than I could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just the affair itself. It was the complete disregard for everything we had built together, including the years of trust, love, and shared memories. Even the fact that she had lost her wedding rings didn't seem to stop her from being careless. I had always believed that those rings were a symbol of her commitment to me, something irreplaceable, something she would never part with. But that night, everything changed. As I looked at the evidence that the private investigator had gathered, I realized how deeply Emma had deceived me. The small, seemingly insignificant details in the report, a missed phone call, a suspicious hotel reservation, painted a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. The photo, taken discreetly outside the hotel, was the final nail in the coffin. I had spent years believing in her, in us, but now I could see the truth. She had been hiding something far darker than I had ever imagined. The fact that she had been so reckless with her actions, even after losing the rings, didn't help matters. It seemed that she was living two separate lives, both of which she kept hidden from me. It hurt to think that all those years of loyalty, all those moments we had shared, meant so little to her. How could she be so careless with our marriage? I couldn't even fathom the reasoning behind it. Perhaps it was something I would never understand. After settling the bill with the private investigator, I took a moment to collect myself before leaving the office. The man behind the desk handed me a thick folder, its contents sealed in an envelope. He also gave me a CD, the files of Emma's surveillance neatly stored inside. I knew this was only the beginning, but the weight of the evidence in my hands made it feel like the end of everything. I took 2 additional copies, one digital and one physical, and made sure to lock them away safely. As I walked out into the brisk afternoon air, I realized I was walking away from a life I once thought I knew. The drive back home was long, but my mind couldn't seem to rest. Every red light, every turn felt like it was stretching time, dragging me through a fog of confusion and pain. I was going through the motions, pretending that I could still maintain control over everything, but deep down, I knew I was falling apart. The house was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. The kids were at school, and Emma was away. It was as though everything had paused for a moment, waiting for the inevitable. I sat down on the couch, the folder from the private investigator in my hands. I had to do something with this information, but I wasn't sure what exactly. My thoughts kept circling back to the divorce papers. I had already reached out to the lawyer, and they had confirmed that everything was ready for filing. But now I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing. Part of me wanted to let her have the freedom she seemed so desperate for, but another part of me, one that had been crushed by her lies, wanted to make her feel the same pain I was going through. I grabbed my phone and called the attorney again, my hands shaking as I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. "Hello, Mr. Davis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to move forward with the divorce. Serve her the papers tomorrow at work." There was a brief pause before he responded. "Of course, I'll arrange everything. You'll have confirmation once it's done." I hung up the phone, my stomach churning. The weight of my decision settled over me, and I realized there was no turning back now. The betrayal had cut too deep. I wasn't sure if I was seeking justice or revenge, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed closure. This was the only way I could get it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I kept replaying the images from the report in my head. The picture of her in the red dress, the absence of the wedding rings, the phone call with the mysterious man. It was all so clear now. She had been hiding something, and the facade she had put up for so long was finally starting to crack. As I waited for Emma to return home, I found myself growing increasingly impatient. I needed to confront her, to ask her why she had done this to us, to our family. But the thought of facing her again, of seeing the woman I once loved, who had now become a stranger to me, was almost too much to bear. When Emma finally returned, it was nearly dusk. She entered the house quietly, her presence no longer a comfort. The house, which had once felt like a home, now felt cold and empty. She walked past me without a word, too focused on her phone to even acknowledge my presence. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. The evidence was right in front of me. What was there left to say? Instead, I watched her for a moment, her back turned to me as she slipped into the kitchen. She seemed so unaware of the storm brewing around her. In that moment, I felt the finality of what was to come. The life we had built together was coming to an end, and there was nothing either of us could do to stop it. I spent the evening alone reflecting on everything that had led to this point. The kids came home, and we ate dinner as a family, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emma seemed distant, her mind elsewhere, just like it had been in the past few weeks. I couldn't help but wonder if she knew, if she had any inkling that I knew everything. After the kids were in bed, Emma came to sit with me on the couch. There was an awkward silence between us, one that felt heavy with unspoken words. I could feel her eyes on me, but I refused to meet her gaze. Her presence no longer comforted me. It felt suffocating. "Are you still feeling unwell?" she asked, breaking the silence. I simply nodded, my throat tight. I didn't want to discuss my health or anything else that would distract from the truth hanging between us. She looked at me for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to say something, but I didn't. She seemed to sense the tension, but either didn't know what to say or didn't care. I felt the distance growing wider with every passing second. By the time I went to bed that night, I had made my decision. Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. I wasn't sure how Emma would react, but I knew it was time. I couldn't live in this lie anymore. The truth was out, and I was ready to face whatever came next. There was no turning back.